David Eagleman, an adjunct professor of psychiatry at Stanford University, recently spoke with Jordan Peterson about brain plasticity, which refers to the brain's ability to adapt and change in response to new experiences and environments.
According to Eagleman, humans are unique in their degree of adaptive flexibility, allowing us to change our environment and perceptions and adapt each generation to a radically new environment. However, this comes at the cost of an intensely long period of socialization.
Eagleman recently created a course for Peterson Academy on brain plasticity, which explores the brain's ability to absorb and adapt to the world around us. He notes that humans are the only species that is as plastic as we are, and that this is the reason why we have been so successful.
Eagleman prefers to use the term live wiring instead of plasticity, as it better describes the brain's complex and dynamic system. The conversation turned to perception, a crucial aspect of brain science.
Peterson notes that perception doesn't work the way people think it does, and that it has profound philosophical implications.
Eagleman's book Incognito explores the idea that almost everything in the brain is happening unconsciously, and that we don't have access to it. He uses the example of eye movement patterns to illustrate this point, noting that when we look at a painting, our eyes are moving in a specific pattern to gather information, but we're not consciously aware of it.
Peterson points out that the empiricist view of the world assumes that we gather data about the world in an objective manner. But this is not the same as being on a mission or having a goal-directed perception. This is because our aims and values structure our perceptions, and we're not just gathering data in a value-free way. Peterson also discusses the idea that a story is a description of the value hierarchy that structures perception. He notes that when we look at the world, there are many ways we could look at any scene, and that our aims and values determine the purpose of our perception. The conversation also delves into the idea of neural networks and personalities, with Nietzsche's view that each drive has its own truth. Peterson explains that a drive is not just a motoric or algorithmic concept, but rather a personality that can dominate and suppress other personality. He suggests that the psychological field should update its model of drive to focus on this personality-like model.
Eagleman agrees and shares his idea of a team of rivals, different neural networks that want different things and battle it out under the hood. They discuss how these rival systems can produce conflicts and how consciousness emerges to mediate these conflicts.
Peterson shares an example of hypothalamic cats, which have had their cortex removed, and how they can still function in a simple environment but struggle with novel situations.
Eagleman explains that consciousness is about mediating these conflicts and making decisions in new situations. He uses the analogy of a CEO who makes decisions when there's trouble or uncertainty. The conversation turns to the topic of Lent and the idea of making changes to one's behavior during this time.
Peterson mentions that he's been trying to understand how to construct superordinate aims that executive function can refer to in order to mediate conflict. He proposes that the quality of an agreement can be judged by its ability to sustain itself across a broader range of contexts and time.
Eagleman suggests that the way different drives and networks form agreements through time is what makes an integrated personality.
Peterson brings up the idea of a Ulysses contract, which is a way of making a contract with oneself that is unbreakable. He gives the example of Ulysses' Odysseus, who had his men lash him to the mast so that he couldn't give in to the temptation of the siren song.
Eagleman explains that this concept is used in various ways, such as in Alcoholics Anonymous, where individuals are encouraged to get rid of all alcohol in their homes to avoid temptation. The conversation also touches on the idea of maturity and how it relates to our ability to think long-term. As we get older, we develop the ability to think about the future and make decisions that will benefit us in the long run. This is closely tied to our ability to form alliances with our future selves and make decisions that will make our future selves happy. But even when we have a clear idea of what we want to achieve, there's always conflict, and we need to be able to adapt and respond to new situations. One way to think about this is to imagine that our brains are constantly trying to burn things into our unconscious minds so we can deal with routine situations without having to think about them too much. But the world is always throwing us curveballs, and we need to be able to adapt and respond to new situations. This is where consciousness comes in. It's what allows us to deal with novelty and make decisions in the face of uncertainty. Eagleman is working on a new book called Empire of the Invisible, which is about all the stuff that we don't see. He's fascinated by why people think they know the truth and why they take their internal models so seriously. This is related to Friston's work, which shows that aim constrains entropy and people cling to their frameworks because it reduces uncertainty. When you enter a high entropy state, you start burning up future resources, and it can have physiological consequences like aging. This is the other side of the emotional landscape, where a constrained aim reduces entropy and has a positive effect on the body. According to Peterson, dopaminergic pleasure is an entropy reduction phenomenon, which is why it's so cool. Imagine having an aim or goal and computing the energy required to get there. The farther away you are from your goal, the more uncertainty there is in the pursuit. But if you take one step towards your goal and succeed, you get a mark of positive emotion, a dopaminergic kick that indicates an entropy reduction. Both positive and negative emotion regulation are associated with entropy reduction, which is why people can get so glued to their worldviews. It's a positive feedback loop, where once you have a point of view on something, you seek data that validates it and ignore data that speaks against it. This is due to confirmation bias and other ways of simplifying information. This is why most things are irrelevant, and it's a good thing, because it would be overwhelming to consider every potential obstacle. However, hallucinogens can blow this apart, making everything relevant and increasing entropy. This can be awe-inspiring, but also very high entropy. As we mature, we learn to hold two contradictory ideas in mind at the same time, which requires a slightly higher entropy state. This is a key aspect of sophisticated thinking, where you voluntarily enter into a higher entropy state to consider different ideas and perspectives. This is also related to the concept of reconsideration, where you think about what if you're wrong about something. This requires a higher entropy state, but it's a more mature and confident way of thinking. In fact, research shows that if you do this voluntarily, the stress consequence is minimized, whereas if it happens involuntarily, the stress consequence is much higher. This is why exposure works in behavior therapy, where people are voluntarily exposed to triggers that they previously found traumatic. By confronting conflict voluntarily, you can reduce the stress consequence and become more resilient. This is especially important in social situations where people are often involuntarily confronted with challenges to their views. But if you can sit in the peace of your own home and think, what if I'm wrong? You can approach the situation with a much calmer and more mature attitude. This is also related to the concept of hierarchy, where the higher you are in a social hierarchy, the lower your entropy state. But when someone challenges you, they're not just questioning your ideas, they're also questioning your validity in that hierarchy. This can cause internal distress and increase entropy, but it's also an opportunity for growth and maturation. In fact, stories of people like Einstein, who were challenged and responded with maturity and humility, are inspiring examples of how to approach challenges with a high-order meta-narrative. This is also related to the concept of hero mythology, where the hero is someone who can handle challenges and see opportunity in them. This is a high-order match that requires a lot of maturation, but it's an attitude that can be practiced. By practicing this attitude, you can become more resilient and better equipped to handle challenges and uncertainties. To access to the detailed insights and summary of each topic discussed in the video, please subscribe to Quick Podcast Summaries on Spotify and Apple Podcasts with free trial, and later, just for the price of candy in most places. Happy listening.